Ohio's death row has seen some of the most horrifying criminals brought to justice. These executions weren't just legal sentences, they were the final chapters in stories filled with cruelty, pain, and irreversible loss. From serial rapists to remorseless killers, these 6 inmates represent the most brutal executions carried out in Ohio before 2026. If you want more unfiltered, true crime stories like this, hit that subscribe button now. Don't forget the notification bell so you never miss the next chilling case. Dennis Maguire. Dennis Maguire's execution marked one of the most controversial and haunting moments in Ohio's modern death penalty history. Not only was his crime horrific in its violence and cruelty, but the way he died raised ethical alarms that reverberated far beyond the prison walls. Dennis Maguire was convicted for the 1989 rape and murder of 22-year-old Joy Stewart in Preble County, Ohio. Stewart, a newlywed who was also 30 weeks pregnant, had her life cut short in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. Maguire, then a 31-year-old drifter with a violent past, encountered Joy when she was on her way to visit family. According to court records, Maguire abducted Joy, then forced himself on her in a brutal sexual assault. Once the attack was over, he used a knife to stab her in the neck multiple times, severing her carotid artery and leaving her to bleed out in a wooded area. He dumped her body in a secluded location where it was discovered days later. An autopsy confirmed she had died from strangulation and stabbing, and that her unborn child perished with her. Maguire wasn't arrested until years later when DNA evidence tied him definitively to the crime. He eventually pleaded guilty and expressed some remorse, but his violent history and the particularly cruel nature of the murder led prosecutors to seek the death penalty. Maguire was executed on January 16, 2014, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. But what should have been a routine lethal injection quickly turned into a national scandal. Ohio, having faced shortages of its standard execution drugs, opted to use a new 2-drug cocktail: midazolam, a sedative, and hydromorphone, a painkiller. It was the first time this combination had been used in the U.S., and the results were horrifying. Witnesses reported that Maguire appeared to struggle violently during the execution. For more than 20 minutes, he gasped, snorted, and writhed on the gurney, prompting outrage from observers and legal experts alike. His chest heaved uncontrollably. Journalists described it as one of the longest and most visibly distressing executions they had ever seen. What was intended to be a humane procedure instead turned into a gruesome spectacle, igniting national debate about the constitutionality of lethal injection protocols. His family filed a federal lawsuit afterward, calling the execution torture and demanding a moratorium on future executions until the method was revised. The outcry was so intense that Ohio placed executions on hold for nearly 3 years while reevaluating its procedures. Last meal. Dennis Maguire's last meal was relatively modest. He requested a roast beef sandwich, a side of fried potatoes, a fruit punch drink, and chocolate chip cookies for dessert. It was a common, almost comforting meal, especially chilling considering the brutality of his crime. Unlike other inmates who used their last meal as a final indulgence or statement, Maguire kept his request simple and unremarkable. Last words. In the moments before he was strapped to the gurney, Maguire offered a brief statement of faith and remorse. He said, "I am going to heaven. I am at peace with my God, but I wish I could tell Joy's family how sorry I am." His tone was reportedly soft and calm, and he did not attempt to justify or explain his actions. Whether his apology was genuine or not is something only the Stewart family can judge. But given the suffering inflicted upon their daughter and her unborn child, many found it hard to accept as adequate. Maguire's execution didn't just end his life. It sparked a national and international reckoning with execution methods in the United States. Human rights organizations condemned the state of Ohio. Legal experts questioned whether the use of untested drug combinations violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. In response, several states paused executions, while others struggled to source reliable drugs after pharmaceutical companies began refusing to supply them for lethal use. For Joy Stewart's family, the controversy around the execution served as an unwelcome reminder of the tragedy that had already consumed their lives. They had waited over 2 decades for justice to be carried out, only to watch it turn into a disturbing and public failure. Dennis Maguire's name may fade from headlines, but the memory of his execution will likely endure as one of the most unsettling in Ohio's modern history, not only for the barbarity of his crime, but for the agonizing way he left this world. Ronald Phillips. In January 1993, 19-year-old Ronald Phillips was living with his girlfriend in Akron, Ohio. While she was away at the hospital, he was left to care for her 3-year-old daughter, Sheila Marie Evans. What unfolded during that brief window of time was devastating. Phillips severely assaulted the child, inflicting injuries that were described by medical experts as consistent with extreme physical abuse. The young girl suffered trauma to her head, internal organs, and limbs. The autopsy revealed deep bruising, a fractured leg, and internal damage that ultimately led to her death. The injuries were so severe that the Summit County coroner determined they could not have been caused accidentally. Phillips initially gave conflicting accounts, including claiming the child had fallen, but the evidence told a different story. As details emerged, authorities charged him with aggravated murder, child abuse, and additional offenses related to the violent assault. In court, prosecutors described the killing as one of the worst cases of child harm they had ever encountered. The jury agreed. Phillips was convicted and sentenced to death in 1993. After more than 24 years on death row, Phillips was executed at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. His execution took place on July 26, 2017, and it was the first in Ohio in more than 3 years. That pause in executions followed a wave of legal challenges surrounding the state's lethal injection protocols, particularly after the highly controversial execution of Dennis Maguire in 2014, which had resulted in visible signs of distress and discomfort. During those intervening years, Phillips's attorneys filed multiple appeals. One notable request was for Phillips to be allowed to donate his organs, a move that drew both praise and skepticism. His legal team argued that his donation could help save lives, while critics labeled it a stalling tactic. The request was ultimately denied due to concerns over the timing and feasibility of organ procurement after execution. On the morning of his execution, Phillips declined any final legal motions. Prison officials administered a 3-drug lethal injection protocol that had been adjusted and approved by the courts. According to official reports, the process proceeded without complication. He was pronounced dead at 10:43 a.m. Last meal. Phillips made a straightforward request for his final meal, avoiding the elaborate or symbolic choices some inmates have made in the past. He asked for pizza. Specific toppings were not disclosed publicly. Fresh strawberries. A large soft drink. Though modest, his request was perhaps an echo of a more ordinary moment, one of the last small decisions he would ever make. Last words. In his final moments, Phillips spoke clearly and directly to the family of Sheila Marie Evans. He offered an apology, something that had been largely absent during his early years on death row. His last words were, "I'm sorry to the family. I wish I could take it back, but I know I can't. I hope you find peace." Those present described his tone as calm and remorseful. Whether the family accepted his apology is unknown, but it was the only public expression of regret that he offered in over 2 decades of incarceration. Gary Otte. In February 1992, 20-year-old Gary Otte left his home in Indiana and traveled to Ohio with a plan, one rooted in addiction, desperation, and a disregard for life. Over the span of 2 days, he carried out a robbery and murder spree that left 2 elderly residents dead and an entire community in shock. His first victim was Frank Bickelman, a 61-year-old man whom Otte followed into an apartment building. Otte knocked on his door, pretending to ask for a phone. Once Bickelman opened the door, Otte forced his way in, robbed him, and shot him point blank in the head. The next day, Otte repeated the pattern. He entered the apartment of 70-year-old Robert Wasikowski, who had lived in the same building, and murdered him in the exact same manner. Both men were shot in the head at close range with a .25 caliber handgun. The murders were cold, calculated, and committed purely for money. Otte used the stolen cash to buy crack cocaine and continued his binge until he was arrested shortly afterward. Police quickly linked him to the crimes, and he confessed. His case moved swiftly through the courts, and in 1993, he was sentenced to death for the two aggravated murders. Throughout his time on death row, Otte acknowledged his guilt but also sought clemency, citing mental health struggles and substance abuse. After nearly 25 years on death row, Gary Otte was executed on September 13, 2017, at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. His execution was one of three that year in Ohio, part of a wave of resumed activity following the lifting of the state's execution moratorium. Otte's legal team filed last-minute appeals, arguing that his history of depression, substance use, and intellectual disability should exempt him from execution. However, the courts rejected the arguments, and Governor John Kasich denied clemency. Witnesses to the execution described a calm, almost surreal atmosphere. Otte showed no signs of resistance or distress. When asked if he had any final words, he did something no one expected. He sang. Last words. In the execution chamber, Gary Otte softly began to sing lines from The Greatest by pop artist Sia, a song often associated with endurance and inner strength. After finishing, he offered a biblical quote, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." These were the same words spoken by Jesus on the cross, and they echoed through the sterile chamber with chilling weight. Some viewed the quote as an act of spiritual defiance or personal peace. Others saw it as a final moment of performative remorse. His final words reflected a combination of resignation and religious symbolism, an eerie conclusion to a life marred by violence. Last meal. For his final meal, Otte chose a classic American comfort spread. He requested a mushroom and Swiss cheese hamburger, French fries, a slice of banana cream pie, and a root beer. It was a humble, diner-style meal, simple, unceremonious, and perhaps chosen to reflect a sense of familiarity before facing the unknown. Otte's execution reignited the debate over executing individuals with mental health issues and those who committed crimes at a young age. His supporters claimed that he had shown growth, remorse, and a desire to turn his life around in prison. They also pointed to the fact that he had been only 20 years old when he committed the murders. Prosecutors, on the other hand, emphasized the premeditated nature of his crimes, his own confessions, and the trauma inflicted on the families of his victims. To them, his execution was long overdue justice. Robert Van Hook. Robert Van Hook's execution closed the book on a case that had haunted the city of Cincinnati for more than 3 decades. His crime was brutal, premeditated, and left a deep impact on both the LGBTQ+ community and the broader public. Though he attempted to halt his execution through mental health defenses, the state ultimately rejected his appeals, and he was put to death in 2018. The crime took place in 1985 when 25-year-old Robert Van Hook entered a gay bar in Cincinnati with a chilling motive. Posing as a friendly companion, he struck up a conversation with David Self, a 25-year-old man. The two left the bar together and went back to Self's apartment, but what happened next was not a simple robbery or a spontaneous act of violence. Once inside, Van Hook attacked Self from behind, choking him unconscious before stabbing him repeatedly in the neck and chest with a kitchen knife. The killing was vicious and calculated. After the stabbing, Van Hook mutilated the body and attempted to cover his tracks before fleeing to Florida. He was arrested days later in Fort Lauderdale, where he confessed to the murder. During his interview with police, Van Hook chillingly admitted that he often pretended to be gay in order to target and rob gay men. The David Self case, according to prosecutors, fit a pattern. Though Van Hook was never officially charged with similar crimes, his statements and behavior raised concerns about predatory violence against vulnerable victims. Robert Van Hook spent more than 33 years on Ohio's death row, filing numerous appeals on the grounds of mental illness, trauma, and ineffective legal counsel. His defense team argued that he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, stemming from childhood abuse and abandonment. They also claimed he was struggling with his sexual identity and that this inner conflict played a role in his actions. Despite these arguments, Ohio's courts upheld the conviction and sentence. In 2018, Van Hook's final requests for clemency were denied by both the courts and Governor John Kasich, who said that the heinous nature of the crime outweighed the mitigating factors. On July 18, 2018, Van Hook was executed by lethal injection at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. Witnesses described the procedure as routine and without visible complications. He was pronounced dead at 10:44 a.m. For his last meal, Van Hook chose a familiar and hearty selection of comfort food. He requested 2 double cheeseburgers, French fries, a strawberry milkshake, and a slice of cherry pie. It was an indulgent spread, one not unlike the classic American diner fare. Some viewed it as a final moment of personal satisfaction before facing the ultimate penalty. Last words. In his final statement, Robert Van Hook appeared composed. He faced the witnesses and offered a brief but direct message. "I'm very sorry for the pain I caused. I hope you can forgive me." There was no attempt to justify his actions, no references to his appeals or past trauma, just a short and solemn acknowledgement of the suffering he had caused. Whether those words offered any comfort to David Self's surviving loved ones is unclear. But for many observers, the execution was the long-awaited end to one of Ohio's most disturbing cases involving targeted violence against gay men. Robert Van Hook's execution did more than deliver a legal sentence. It reignited discussion around hate crimes, mental health and trauma defenses, and the treatment of LGBTQ+ victims in the justice system. Advocacy groups noted that his case underscored the vulnerability of gay men during the 1980s, a time when such crimes were often overlooked or underreported. Christopher Newton. Christopher Newton was already serving time at the Mansfield Correctional Institution for aggravated robbery when he killed his cellmate in 2001. His victim was Jason Brewer, a 27-year-old man with whom Newton had been sharing a cell. According to investigative reports, Newton became angry over what he described as breaches of prison etiquette. In a cold and calculated attack, Newton stabbed Brewer 93 times with a makeshift weapon. He then waited several hours before notifying a corrections officer, confessing to the murder in chilling detail. Newton told investigators that he and Brewer had argued, and after plotting the murder, he carried it out with deliberate precision. The sheer number of stab wounds, many of which were to the chest and neck, indicated sustained rage and intent. It wasn't a spontaneous fight. It was a prolonged act of violence. Following the murder, Newton pleaded guilty and openly asked for the death penalty, stating that he deserved it for what he had done. The court agreed. In 2003, he was sentenced to death for killing Brewer, with the aggravated nature of the attack playing a central role in the decision. On May 24, 2007, Christopher Newton was scheduled for execution by lethal injection at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility in Lucasville. What was meant to be a straightforward procedure turned into a disturbing and drawn-out event that exposed major flaws in Ohio's execution process. For more than 2 hours, medical technicians struggled to insert an intravenous line. Newton was a large man, and the team had trouble locating suitable veins. Witnesses reported that he was stuck repeatedly, at least 10 times on both arms, hands, and legs. At one point, he was removed from the gurney and allowed to sit upright while they continued searching for a vein. Corrections officials paused the procedure temporarily and consulted medical experts before continuing. Eventually, the IV was successfully inserted into his left arm, and the lethal chemicals were administered. He was pronounced dead at 11:53 a.m., more than 90 minutes after the initial attempt began. Though Newton remained calm and cooperative during the ordeal, the botched preparation raised concerns from legal scholars and human rights organizations. It also prompted Ohio to reassess its lethal injection protocols, though similar problems would later surface in other executions. Last meal. True to his larger-than-life presence, Newton requested a massive final meal, a spread that reflected both indulgence and a last moment of freedom through food. His request included steak, fried chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, green beans, cornbread, cherry pie, and a soft drink. The meal was a traditional Southern-style comfort feast, packed with rich flavors and heavy portions. It was one of the most extensive last meal requests in Ohio's death penalty records. Last words. As he lay on the gurney, Christopher Newton offered a composed and quiet farewell. His final words were, "I've made peace with what's coming. I'm sorry it ended up like this." He didn't attempt to shift blame or revisit his appeals. He simply acknowledged the gravity of his actions and the consequences he had accepted. His demeanor was described as calm and resigned. Newton's execution became part of a growing body of evidence showing the operational flaws and ethical concerns surrounding lethal injection. Though his crime was undeniably brutal, the length and complications of his execution sparked outrage and renewed calls for more humane alternatives or systemic reform. Unlike many death row inmates who fight the system to the end, Newton embraced his sentence. He confessed, cooperated, and expressed remorse. Still, the way his life ended highlighted serious procedural failures that Ohio would grapple with for years to come. For Jason Brewer's family, Newton's death may have closed a tragic chapter, but for the public it left lingering questions. Not just about justice, but about how justice is carried out. These 5 executions weren't just about punishment. They marked the tragic ends to stories that shook entire communities. The pain of the victims' families, the coldness of the crimes, and the eerie calm of death row, all of it stays etched in Ohio's justice system. Which of these stories stuck with you the most? Let us know in the comments. Like this video if you think their crimes truly warranted the ultimate punishment. And don't forget to subscribe for more gripping stories straight from America's death chambers. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned, because justice doesn't rest, and neither do the stories behind it.